Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
Good morning. I have to ask for your forgiveness straight away this morning, because not only have I picked the least manly water cup going, I've also got a stain on my jeans and my t-shirt, which I've just noticed. So yeah, did my mother teach me nothing growing up? But it's really good to see you all, and we're going to be doing our fifth chapter, I suppose, in the seven-part series that we're looking at the moment, looking at the seven letters to the early churches in Revelation. And this morning we're looking at the letter to the church in Sardis, which is in Revelation 3 and verses 1 to 6. And as has been mentioned a couple of times now, these letters were written by the Apostle John, and they were written to the early churches in Asia Minor off the back of a prophetic vision that John receives from Jesus in the first chapter of Revelation. So in essence, this is Jesus writing to the church. Now, in ancient Asia Minor, the church in Sardis was located directly south of the church in Thyatira that Katie looked at last week, and north of Ephesus and Smyrna that we've looked at in some of the previous weeks as well. A little bit of trivia for you. So the church here in this particular place was a place that actually used to be the capital of the ancient kingdom Lydia, which was apparently the place where coins were first used as currency, and also the first place to ever establish permanent retail shops as well. And also it was a place that had a pretty renowned army, especially due to the skill of their archers. So it was a real place of history, it was a place of heritage, it was a place of innovation. It was quite a proud city, in fact. Now, it was also a place that at this time that we read about during the period of Revelation that was still under the authority of the Roman Empire as well. But actually, this Roman rule is not the thing that Jesus raises as his biggest concern with regards to the church in Sardis. You know, over the last few weeks, we've heard about various different concerns that are raised to the various churches that we've looked at. And, you know, Jesus, through John, has raised all kinds of things, from poverty to affliction to sexual immorality to idol worship, all sorts of stuff. And on a number of occasions, we've had other people partly attributed to in terms of the blame. So we've had other negative influences named in some of these previous chapters. So Jezebel's been mentioned, the Nicolaitans have been mentioned, Balaam has been mentioned, even Satan himself has been mentioned in some of these previous letters that we've studied. But we don't get any of that in this letter to the church in Sardis. There are no other potential external negative influences mentioned at all. And I think that's important, because the reason for that is quite simple. And that is that the concern that Jesus raises to the church in Sardis is a concern that's down to the guys in the church 100%. So it's down to the members of the church and nobody else. So let's read this passage together. I'm reading from Revelation 3, verses 1 to 6, and I'm reading from the NIV translation. To the angel of the church of Sardis write, "These are the words of him who holds the seven spirits of God and the seven stars. I know your deeds. You have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead. Wake up, strengthen what remains and is about to die. For I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God. Remember, therefore, what you have received and heard, hold it fast and repent. But if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know what time I will come to you. Yet you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. They will walk with me dressed in white, for they are worthy. The one who is victorious will, like them, be dressed in white. I will never blot out the name of that person from the book of life, but will acknowledge that name before my Father and his angels. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches." So in essence, what we find in the church in Sardis is a widespread retirement attitude, essentially. We find people that we're told have a reputation for being alive, but in fact are dead. We find a people that we're told need to wake up, So there's this idea of slumber, spiritual slumber in the church in Sardis. And we find a people and a work that is unfinished in the sight of God. So in a nutshell, there's a church here that look the part, and this is becoming a recurring theme as we go through this series, that there are churches in this part of the world at this time that look a certain way from the external, but actually when you get beneath the surface, there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. We've got a bunch of people here that look like respectable Christians. We're told they've got a reputation for being alive. And they're in a place that's got a reputation for being innovative and with a lot of pride and a lot of history. But actually, when you scratch beneath the surface of what's going on in Sardis, these guys aren't actually doing a lot anymore. They've stopped pressing on in their walk with God. They've stopped pushing on into further things of God. And actually, they're in this place of slumber. They're in this place of complacency, of apathy. And we know that John's speaking to a decent proportion of the congregation here in Sardis as well, because he specifically says, there are only a few of you who haven't soiled your clothes. Let's just think on that image for a moment, soiled clothes, and let's contrast it to verse 5, where he says, there will be those that are victorious and are dressed in white. It's not a particularly pleasant image, is it? Soiled clothes. And there were cultural reasons that Jesus would have probably used this imagery, because actually in pagan temples at the time, you wouldn't have been able to enter the temple if you had dirty clothes on, or if you had ragged clothes on. They would literally have denied you entry to the temple because it was seen as disgraceful, it was seen as disrespectful. So, there's this idea of not being allowed entry that kind of relates to this imagery. And clearly, there's also an implication here that this is talking about our eternal salvation. And that actually, if we're in this place of spiritual apathy, of spiritual complacency, then we are potentially endangering our eternal salvation. In verse 3, Jesus says, I will come like a thief, and you will not know what time I will come to you. So that's serious enough. This is obviously a serious thing that Jesus is talking about here through John to the church in Sardis. But actually, the other thing is, if you soil your clothes, then you fundamentally ruin them. You ruin everything that has gone into making those clothes. You've ruined their value. You've ruined their worth. So actually, if we are in a place today where we've come to a place of apathy in our walk with Jesus, a place of complacency, then not only are we potentially risking what comes later, but we're also ruining what's already been done. We're ruining all the good that God has done in our life up to this point, and we're ruining all the good that we may have done in service to God up to this point in our life as well. On the flip side of that, we read here the few that are dressed in white. And the colour white is mentioned a lot in the Bible. In the King James Version, it's mentioned 75 times in the Bible. And it's normally used in reference to a whole host of very, very positive things in the Bible. From purity to righteousness to holiness and to dedication to God as well. So the ones that are victorious, and that means the ones that overcome this attitude of apathy, the ones that overcome this attitude of complacency are the ones that will be seen by God as pure, as righteous, and as holy. But we read that there are only a few like this in the church in Sardis. There are only a few that are truly awake and alive in their faith. So that tells us two things. It tells us firstly that this is a mindset that's very easy to slip into. And therefore it tells us that secondly, it's something that we need to be especially cautious of as Christians. It's this attitude of winding down almost. And actually, one of the dangers of winding down is that once you do, it's very, very difficult to get yourself going again. And I think that's true in almost every situation in life. Maybe you can relate to this in the wind down for Christmas if you work. I know that I struggle with this because by late November, I'm already starting to wind down for Christmas. I'm strolling into work a bit later. I'm leaving a bit later. The Christmas parties start, the Christmas drinks start, everyone's in a good mood all the time. And I have 4 or 5 weeks that seem quite relaxed and seem quite good fun. So then when January strikes, it's especially difficult to get yourself going again and to get back into the rhythm and the rigor of working life. Also, if any of you have ever trained for any sort of endurance event, you'll know that this is especially true, whether that's a long walk that you've done or a cycle or a swim or a run or whatever. But when you get to a certain point where you allow your body to start slowing down in those situations, it's incredibly difficult to get back up to the speed and the momentum that you had in the first place. And I think that this is kind of similar to our walk with Jesus. that I think there's a rhythm and there's a rigor to a healthy walk with Jesus. And actually, when little things start to just fall away, and when we start to lose that rhythm, it can lead to problems. And even in the really seemingly small things about our faith, we just start to read our Bible a little bit less, or we just start to go to church that little bit less often. We just start to spend a little bit less time praying than maybe we did before. Then these things can really start to chip away at our relationship with Jesus. I think it all comes down to motivation, really. Because when we're truly motivated about something, we're always pushing to further ourselves in that field. If you spoke to the most successful businessmen, sportsmen, musicians, politicians, I think they'd all say the same thing. That actually motivation is the single most important thing to success in any field. In William Shakespeare's tragedy, Othello, it says, "'Tis in ourselves that we are thus or thus. Our bodies are our gardens, to which our wills are our gardeners." So it's our will, it's our motivation that really determines who we actually become. And it seems that the church in Sardis have just started to lose some of that motivation. Some of that eagerness that maybe they once had is starting to slip away, and they're no longer pressing on in their relationships with God to the same degree that maybe they once were. And actually to the point where John says that they need to strengthen what little remains of that motivation. So what little remains of that drive, they need to really strengthen it, because there's a risk that it's about to die altogether. That's what he says. And for me, this is key to the whole passage. This is about to die. And there's an urgency around that we have to understand this morning. Because when something is about to die, it requires immediate, urgent attention. And this made me think about a time when we were kids, and my sister Amy had a hamster, which she called Marmalade. And I'm expressively saying that it was her hamster, because I don't want any blame for that name being attributed to myself. But she had a hamster called Marmalade, and we were about to go on holiday for a couple of weeks to Spain. And just before we left the house, we remembered, the hamster. We haven't fed the hamster. And then we realised very quickly, in a scene of panic, that actually no one had fed the hamster for quite a number of weeks. So we ran into the kitchen, and what we found was an empty water bottle, an empty bowl of food, and a very, very still hamster. I thought he was already dead, I have to say. We're sort of frantically shaking the cage, we're kind of shouting at this thing, and he just kind of is twitching his nose a little bit, but this thing was as close to dead as anything I've ever seen in my life. So anyway, everyone went into action positions. Dad grabbed the hamster out of the cage, basically opened his mouth and just poured water down into him, basically having to close his mouth for him. He managed to get some cucumber out of the cupboard and was kind of chucking that down him as well, desperately trying to revive this hamster, performing mini hamster CPR on him at the same time. And slowly but surely, he did start to come back to life. He started to have a little bit more mobility in his body. His eyes opened up a little bit wider. And he did eventually make a full recovery by some miracle. But he was very, very close to death. And had it not been for Dad's urgent response, he would have died, without doubt. And there's an urgency like that John's writing about in the church to Sardis here. This is something that needs to be strengthened quickly. It's an action that needs to happen quickly. And if we're in that place today of spiritual slumber or spiritual retirement, then we need to know that it's urgent. And it's something we need to deal with straight away. I want us to actually have a quick look at the last words that Jesus says to his disciples. And this is after his resurrection, and it's before he goes to join the Father in heaven. And it's often referred to as the Great Commission, which we find in Matthew 28, verses 16 to 20. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. And there are just two things that I want to bring out of this passage. And what I want us to understand is, first of all, what it is that Jesus really asks of his disciples. What is it that he really asks of them, and therefore what is it that he's asking of us? And then secondly, what he promises back in return to his disciples, i.e. to us. I think the first thing to say is he doesn't actually ask anything. He commands it. And when you go back into the ancient language that was used here, it was very much an instruction that Jesus was giving rather than a request. So therefore, to make disciples of all nations, to baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, that's not something we have a choice over if we choose to follow Jesus. It's an instruction. And note that there's no time restriction put on this command. He doesn't say go and make disciples until you're tired. He doesn't say go and make disciples until you're old. He doesn't say go and make disciples until somebody else comes and makes disciples for you. This is a lifelong instruction that we're given here. It's a lifelong commitment that he's calling us to until he calls us back home. And the language is really deliberate here as well. It's go and make. It's really proactive. It's the complete opposite to any form of slumber. It's a really proactive, purposeful language that's used here. But there is a danger that after a period of time as Christians, whether that is a few years or a few decades, that we can actually just slip into a place of reactiveness rather than proactiveness. And although I'm talking about evangelism here in the context of the Great Commission, I'm not talking exclusively about evangelism this morning in the wider context. Obviously, evangelism is an incredibly important part of any Christian's life, but actually there are so many different areas that we can fall into a state of slumber with when it comes to our walk with Jesus. It can be in how much time we spend with Jesus on a day-to-day basis, on a week-by-week basis. It can be how much we encourage other people in their walks with Jesus. It can be how often we spend time seeking God for what he wants for us in the next season of our lives. How aware are we of that? How much time do we spend on those kind of things? And that kind of attitude of spiritual slumber is the complete antithesis of what Jesus then says to his disciples. Because he says, "And surely I am with you always, even until the very end of the age." Jesus' commitment to us is eternal. It's lifelong while we're on this earth, and then it's eternal after this life. You see, Jesus doesn't have a retirement attitude over us in any way, shape, or form. There's no time scale to which Jesus works when it comes to the love of his people and the love for his people. So we can't afford to have any sort of spiritual apathy when it comes to our side of that agreement as well. And I want to make a really important point here, that spiritual retirement doesn't necessarily have anything to do with age at all. Spiritual retirement does not have anything to do with how old you are. Because frankly, there are people in this church in their 60s, 70s, 80s who put me to shame with the tenacity in which they still pursue and love Jesus Christ. It doesn't matter if you're in your 20s or if you're in your 90s, this is something that we can all struggle with. I know that even at the age of 26, which I'm sure you'll all agree is relatively young, I can see times in my life when I've been in a sort of period of spiritual retirement and spiritual apathy. I've been a Christian for probably 15 years now, something like that. And to give you an example, for the vast majority of those 15 years, I've been the senior drummer here at Living Well Church. And that was until about 2 years ago when Ashley went off to drum college and got better than me, but we don't really talk about that very often. But yeah, so I've kind of grown up drumming in church, and it was something that I got into such a habit of doing that there's definitely a period in my sort of mid-teens when I was definitely doing it out of a sense of habit and out of duty, rather than a true worshipful heart. And I know that there were Sunday mornings when frankly I would much rather have stayed in bed than got up early and gone to the worship practice before church. But I didn't tell anybody about it, and I didn't do anything differently. I carried on through a sense of duty. Because I didn't want to raise questions. I didn't want anyone to think that anything was wrong. I didn't want to admit that anything was wrong. But I know when I look back now that maybe to everyone else I looked alive, but in fact in that season I was dead spiritually. I was in a place where I was just doing the things that I was used to doing, rather than doing them from a place of motivation. And that was at just 15 or 16 years old. So this is nothing to do with age, what we're talking about this morning. This is something that we can all fall into. So what can actually cause us to become complacent or to become apathetic in our Christian walks? I just want to play you a 1-minute video, which is from my favourite film, a film called Gladiator. And I think this helps to just explain maybe a few of the potential reasons that we can fall into a spirit of apathy.
My home. My wife is preparing food. My daughters carry water from the river. Will I ever see them again? I think not.
Do you believe you'll see them again when you die?
I think so. But then, I will die soon. They will not die for many years. I'll have to wait.
But you would. Wait.
Of course.
You see, my wife and my son are already waiting for me.
You'll meet them again. But not yet. Not yet. Yes.
Not yet. Not yet.
So just to explain a bit about what's going on there for those of you that haven't seen the film, and anyone under the age of 15 shouldn't have seen the film because it's 15 rated. But what's going on here? We've got Russell Crowe's character Maximus, and Maximus is a guy who was one of the chief commanders of the Roman armies at this time, at around the height of Rome's power, sort of 180 AD, this kind of period. And when the film starts, Maximus is just finishing a 12-year campaign against a barbarian horde from Germania. So he's just finished this 12-year-long campaign that he's been on. And he was a very, very successful, very respected Roman general. He was much loved by the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, so much to the degree that actually at the beginning of the film, the emperor tells him that he wants him to succeed him as emperor when he dies, instead of his son Commodus, who would be the rightful heir. And Commodus catches wind of this, and before any of it can be made public, he murders his father. And he then, when Maximus refuses to submit to him, he murders Maximus's family, he burns his house to the ground, and he tries to murder him as well. But Maximus escapes, and is then captured by some slave traders that sell him to a slave owner called Proximo, who then uses him as a gladiator in the arena. So that's the context of what's going on here. And that's where he meets his friend, the other character in that scene, Juba. And you can tell from Maximus's body language and his general demeanor in this scene that actually he's really struggling for the motivation to continue. You know, he's thinking about the fact that he hasn't got a huge amount to live for at this point, and he's struggling for the motivation. And if you put yourself in his shoes, you can kind of understand why, maybe. You know, really successful guy, incredibly highly thought of, highly respected. He's just finished a 12-year-long campaign, so in a nutshell, his job's almost finished in that sense. You know, he was planning to retire back to his home in the country. So his job's done. He's also had everything in this world that means something to him taken away from him. His family, his property, his horses. He's now gone from being an incredibly respected guy to being a slave. So he's living like a slave. He's living in horrible conditions. He's having to fight in the arena day by day. And all the time that he does all of this, the guy that put him there is sitting on the emperor's throne. The job that he should have had, in fact. So you can't blame him for maybe feeling a little bit like he might be done in this situation. So let's just break that down into three of the potential scenarios that we can maybe find ourselves in our walks with Jesus. First of all, do we think we've come to a place where our job is finished? Because if we do, if we think we've come to a place where actually we have nothing left to offer, then we are going to really struggle for motivation. And maybe this particular scenario might be slightly more applicable to our older generation, potentially. You know, maybe you feel that once you had a really vibrant ministry, you know, once God used you in a really powerful way, but that actually you've grown too old for that now, or you don't have the energy for that anymore. Maybe you feel like, you know, church has moved on since that period, and actually, you know, what you were doing back then is no longer applicable to the way that we do things here. Maybe you feel that your gift is now redundant, or the way that you used to be used is now surplus to requirements. Well, let me tell you that all of that is a lie. All of that is a lie. Because yes, the body loses its strength, and yes, there are things that as we get older, we can't do anymore. But as Paul writes to the Ephesians in chapter 6, verse 12, our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Our struggle is against the rulers and authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. That's where our battle is. And actually, you never get too old for that battle. On the contrary, actually, the older and more experienced you are, the more equipped you are for that battle, the more you have to offer to that battle. And the Bible is littered with the benefits of old age. Job 12 verse 12 says, "Is not wisdom found among the aged? Does not long life bring understanding?" Proverbs 20 verse 29, "The glory of young men is their strength. Grey hairs are the splendor of the old." And perhaps there's a pride issue that we have to get over a little bit when we reach a certain point. Because it's not easy to accept that we maybe can't do the things that we once did. And even as a 26-year-old, I find it infuriating that I can't do the things I once did on a football pitch when I was 20 years old, or whatever, and a little bit thinner. But the Bible is clear. That's not an excuse. That's not an excuse to come to a place of spiritual retirement. It's not an excuse to stop investing in our relationship with God. And it's not an excuse to stop investing our time and our efforts in local church either. It just means that maybe those roles change slightly. Maybe they're used in a slightly different way when you reach a certain point. So that's the first scenario. The second one is, do we feel that we've been let down or we've been mistreated in some way? And this is one that I see quite a lot. And I see it across all kinds of churches, all sorts of ages of people, and all sorts of demographics, is that when people allow the feelings of hurt or the feelings of mistreatment by other people to actually affect and stem the flow of their relationship with God. Particularly when they feel aggrieved by maybe the leadership of the church. Maybe they feel that certain decisions have been made that they don't agree with, or that things have been said from the platform which have been insensitive or have been taken more personally than maybe they were intended. Because even things as trivial as that, as seemingly trivial as that, can really start to have an effect on us. And it can really start to have an effect on our motivation. And that then has a knock-on effect in our relationship with Jesus. I think another big one in this context is maybe seeing other people in roles at church that maybe we feel that we should be in. Or people being used in ways that we feel we should be used. And Beth actually talked about this a few weeks ago in a sermon that she was preaching, about how she used to feel when she was younger about preaching, actually. And when she'd see other people preaching and she felt that she should be, and she kind of admitted that it led to a bitterness that she had to deal with. It was something she actually consciously had to make the decision to deal with. And I felt this when I was younger as well. Again, back when I first started drumming in church, at probably the age 12, 13, something like that, I was very much the second drummer at that point. There was another guy, Mark John, who many of you will remember, and he was older than me. He'd been drumming a bit longer than me, and therefore he was the number one drummer. I was very much the number two. And after a while, that started to grate on me a lot, actually. And I didn't really tell anybody about it at the time, but I started to feel like, actually, I'm just as good as Mark John. So why am I not being used in the same way that he is? And it was probably quite an immature attitude, actually, in truth. But when I look back, I can see that that had an effect on me. And it had an effect on the way that I went about my walk with Jesus during that period as well. Because if we allow ourselves to kind of start to feel sorry for ourselves and start to feel victimized, then it leads to sulking, frankly. And sulking can take many forms. I've learned this because I've got 4 siblings, and they all sulk in very different ways. For some people, it's a very external thing. No, that was normally Amy. She was the more external one. For others, it would be a very, very quiet internal sulking. That was more Jordan, I would have said. And sometimes that second one is even worse, because it just stays inside, and it just eats away at you for quite a long time. And it will, without doubt, if it's in the context of church, it will start to affect your relationship with Jesus in some way. So I would encourage you, if that's where you are today, if you're in a place where you feel like that, then go and speak to somebody about it. Go and speak to the person involved. Or speak to one of the leaders. But don't keep it bottled up inside, because it will affect you. And it can lead to this place of apathy and this place of complacency. You know, just as Jesus says, you know, go and do this, go and make disciples. There's a decisiveness, there's a deliberateness that's needed in our response to these kind of things. Let's deal with these situations head on. And then the third scenario, do we find ourselves in an unhappy situation that we think is unrecoverable? Do we think we're in an unsalvageable place this morning in our lives or in our walks with Jesus? Because in this video clip, Maximus, he's on the verge of giving up. And he's on the verge of giving up because of the situations that he finds himself in life. He looks around, he looks at all that's happened to him over the last few months, and he can't actually see any point, almost, in going on. He can't see any point in fighting on. Actually, earlier in the film, there's a scene where he's pitted against another gladiator in training to see how good he is. And even though he's an incredible fighter, a trained general in the army, he just stands there and lets this other guy strike him again and again and again, because he can't see the point in carrying on. He can't see the point in pushing on. He's lost his motivation completely to the point where he's on his knees. And yet his friend Juba says to him, "You're not done yet." He says, "Not yet. No, there will be a time when you have nothing else to give. There will be a time when you've got nothing else to achieve in this life, and you've got nothing else to offer. But that time is not yet. You are not finished," he says, essentially. And I believe that's what God says to each and every one of us this morning. You are not finished. We are not finished. Regardless of where we are, regardless of what we're going through, we're not done until the day we leave this earth. And that's an attitude that we've got to carry with us. But what's so encouraging about that is that Jesus says, "I will be with you every single step of the way. Even until the very end of the age, I will be with you. Even until your final breath, I will be with you." There are a number of parallels in this passage to the first letter that John wrote to the church in Ephesus, which I preached on in our first week. And back then I talked about 3 R's: to remember, to repent, and to redo. And in verse 3 of this passage that we're looking at today, it says, "Remember therefore what you have received and heard, hold it fast, and repent." If we are in any of those places today, or any other place that we know is leading to a spiritual apathy in our lives, then the time to act is now. The time to do something about it is now. Remember why you're here. Remember what it is that even means you're sat here today. What is it that brought you here? Remember that and hold on to it for dear life. Because our relationship with Jesus is such a precious thing. Is it not the most precious thing that we could have? So we need to defend it. We need to protect it with our lives. Like the most important thing in our life is about to die. That's the urgency and the tenacity with which we need to approach this. I think the common theme in all of these letters is that we actually need to be really real with ourselves at this point. As with a lot of the churches that we've studied already, it's very easy to put up barriers, and it's very easy to give off an image that we're all fine and that everything's okay. It's also very easy to look back and think, you know what, I've actually come a long way, and to start to get content with that. And I'm guilty of this because I sometimes look back, and some of you here won't even remember this time, but I look back to when we were 30 people in the Lidden building. And I sometimes fall into the attitude of, you know what, God, you've brought us so far. How blessed we are with how far you've brought us. And I start to get a little bit content with where we're at. But actually, I believe Jesus says to us today, individually and as a church, wake up. Strengthen what remains and is about to die. For I have found your deeds unfinished. We're unfinished, church, today. There's much more to do. Amen.